Hello, everyone. We're going to take a brief moment today to talk about religion and philosophy during the Romantic period. Alright, so if you remember what Romanticism is a movement that really tries to embrace inner emotion, it tries to talk about the divine, the appreciation of the divine, of nature. All of these things are kind of really huge to the Romantic movement, as well as individualism, which is going to be very characteristic of what's going on during the religious movements during this time period. Instead of just trying to understand God, just embrace God, accept it, enjoy the feeling it gives. Alright, so during this time period, we're going to see one of our primary religious figures come from a kind of an interesting background. A guy by the name of John Wesley is raised Anglican, but on a trip from England to America, he gets caught in a huge storm. His ship does. And he goes through this huge religious conversion during this time period, saying, hey, if you help me live through this, I will really reinvest myself into my faith and in that wonderful experience. Well, what this results in is Wesley kind of developing an ideology that's much more personal in the Romantic view, and we call this Methodism. It's a practical piety, personal religion. It stresses your heartfelt belief in God and your heartfelt experiences with God. And is also very optimistic in relation to some of the other faiths like Calvinism that had, pretty significant followings in England, and that believes that there is a possibility for perfection in this world, and that perfection is really shown through an outward expression of our love of God and God's love to us. So, this Methodist movement is going to be pretty significant as it grows to one of the largest Christian denominations in the world. Clearly, Roman Catholicism is still the largest, but outside of that, we see significant movement towards Methodism in Europe. And considering it's one of the last significant European Christian faiths developed, it's impressive. Well, we also see a significant change in how people will approach religion in general. So we saw back in the French Revolution an attempt by the Radical Revolution to really just get rid of the Catholic faith. And then once the Radical Revolution ended, we see a huge revival of Catholicism in France and in Europe. But it's going to be a little different. Um, it's a much more passionate love of the faith. People aren't going to like the very logical approach to religion that you saw in the French Revolution or even in the Enlightenment. It's going to be about that heartfelt connection. So we see people like Viscount Francois René de Chateaubriand, who's going to say that the essence of religion is passion, or that religions are a unique expression of the emotional experience that comes from knowing an infinite being. Friedrich Schleiermacher. I can't pronounce that name correctly. I've never been able to. So we see that emotional resonance with religion that really becomes the dominant aspect of religion during the Romantic period. Well, we also see a change in philosophy as well too. We've already introduced some of the other major philosophical people during this time period, people like Immanuel Kant, who are going to be vital in kind of bridging that difference between God and logic. Kant is still a major player during this period, but we also see two other major players come out. Society is changing in how it views people. Individualism is huge, and with individualism comes a recognition of difference. And some people during this time period are taking difference and inherently making difference wrong. And we're going to see some philosophers during this time period who are going to have radical issues with that. First of which is going to be a man named Johann Gottfried Herder. He believes that humanity develops organically, and we develop at different areas and different places at different rates. It doesn't mean that one is better than another one, it just means it's developed at different rates of progress. And that reality is those differences should not be glossed over, they should not be denigrated, they should be cherished. They are different experiences, different traditions developed out of that human experience. This is pretty positive in comparison to a lot of the other ideologies around during this time period, particularly when you start to take into account race and ethnic background. There's a lot of division in Europe when it comes to racism of particularly non-Europeans, whether they're African or Asian or Native American. That's pretty huge during this time period. We're going to talk about that a lot more, especially when we see the rise of a new form of imperialism in the late 19th century. But the most major player is not exactly Herder. It's actually a different guy. Guy who's a little bit more complex to understand, and his name is Hegel. Hegel has a very unique vision of the world. Unfortunately, his writing kind of masks a lot of his vision. It's very complicated, it's very wordy and verbose, and it is a task to understand. But we're going to break down some of his key pieces simply here, as best we can. What he believes is something called the dialectic theory. And the dialectic theory is basically this, that humanity makes mistakes. And when we make mistakes, we try to overcorrect for that mistake. And when we overcorrect, we make a second mistake. And then we have to bring ourselves back to the middle. And that's when we finally develop progress. We finally make improvements on the human experience. So one great example of this is the French Revolution. French Revolution is radical, and it's violent, and it's frustrating, and it does not live up to the ideals it's supposed to. So what do the French people do? They overcorrect and choose a Napoleon as a ruler who is violent and caused the deaths of millions, and it's not what they wanted. So eventually they come back in the middle and develop a constitutional monarchy. Now, as we all know, that monarchy that they established has had a few hurdles in its establishment, but it is better than either extreme of the radical revolution or Napoleon. Well, next, he also believes that human development is dependent on prior stages of human development. All of our understanding comes from building upon prior times, and we need to go back to those prior times to learn things we may have forgotten unless we study them. There is always something that we can learn in history when we look back, even if there are things that we don't agree with. So this is huge. Now, there's actually going to be an interesting study. We're going to use this, and it's kind of comparison that's used by historians to illustrate the differences between Herder and Hegel. It has to deal with understanding Islam during this time period. Each of these different philosophers had a different interpretation of how to appreciate and understand Islam. But both of them thought they were a civilization that was unique and needed to be studied. Herder, though, believes that when you look at Islam, you see how vital it is to the dynamic that exists today. The conflict between Christianity and Islam really characterized the modern day European experience. And also loves the characteristics of the stories that are promoted in stories like the Arabian Nights and 1001 Nights that are portrayed during this time period. Hegel, on the other hand, says that there are tremendous truths in the Islamic world that we should understand, that will improve our society. But the reality is that Islam itself is probably fading. What he saw is the Ottoman Empire fading into the past. Like, we see that it was just that political body. He thought it was the entire faith in and of itself, not really separating the faith from a dying political institution. But in studying Islam, we would radically improve our own understandings of humanity and ourselves. So we have kind of a competing tradition that comes out of this time period, but what's important is that both of them do believe in the appreciation and understanding of various different cultures. They should not be subjugated, they should not be denigrated, they should be cherished and honored and explored. So Romanticism and its search for individuality and individual experience really is going to leave a lasting impact on both religion and philosophy during this period. Thanks and have a great day.